Thank you, Rahul, for that note and really, setting the momentum for the day. Now, for those of you just plugging in, this is day one of the Enterprise Innovation Summit 2021, presented by Yota and our gold partners Commvault, HP Enterprise Unique Solutions, Infoblox, Tata Communications, Veeam, Versec, Uptime Institute, and Zoom. Now, what are the elements that you need to factor in as you plan digital transformation? Now, our first session for the day addresses just that. We have Dave Vellante, the co-founder and CEO of SiliconANGLE Media, with us in conversation with Sarbjeet Johal, cloud consultant. Now, Dave is a long-time tech industry analyst, entrepreneur, writer, and speaker. He's a co-host at theCUBE, which is known as really, the ESPN of tech, and manages SiliconANGLE Media with his business partner, John Furrier. Now, he's also the co-founder of the Cube Network and CrowdChat. Now, Sarbjeet has worked with more than 50 Fortune 1000 companies in the last 20 years in different capacities, and he is a leading expert in cloud architecture, pre-sales, data center applications, and cloud migrations. Now, let's listen into this conversation.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Ashwin. Our today's guest is an OG, the original gangster of analysts in high tech. He's a Bostonian, and he's a co-founder of theCUBE and chief research officer at SiliconANGLE. It's my privilege to welcome Dave Vellante. Thanks, Dave, for joining us today.
Hey, Sarbjeet, great to see you. Always fun collaborating with you, man.
Thank you, thank you. So in today's talk, Dave, we want to cover the innovation through infrastructure. And we will also cover the flip side of that, the innovation in infrastructure at the same time. And in my view, the definition of infrastructure has been changing over decades, right? What we used to call infrastructure in high tech. The definition has been changing. I want to get your take on it. You being in it for good 25 to 30 years, and you have interviewed the best of the best in the tech industry. You guys do that. How do you see the infrastructure developments happening out there? And then in the later part of the discussion, we can talk about how the CIOs and CXOs can adopt that.
It's interesting you say that it's changing, because in a lot of ways it's changed, in a lot of ways it's staying the same. And when I entered the industry when I was a little kid, it was a mainframe and everything was just in a package. But within that package, there was still plumbing. It was from chips to database. I mean, the stack was semiconductors, there was compute, there was storage, there was networks, there was security, middleware, and database. And that's how I sort of think about the infrastructure stack. And having said that, it was all sort of bundled, back in the early days of the 80s and maybe even before that. And then the industry blew up with the PC revolution, and you had these sort of fragmented lines of the stack. And that's kind of where we are today, although now it's sort of coming back to the cloud, right? Where there are services that you invoke and call. And then you've got, surrounding data center infrastructure, which in many cases is going away for a lot of companies, but there's still obviously a lot of data centers out there. So it's ebbed and flowed, but the state of infrastructure, I think, has changed quite dramatically.
Yeah, on that note, I believe that the cloud has sort of democratized the compute, if you will, or computing in general. Like that means compute, storage, and a network side of things, all three, right? So with that said, I think it not only has brought in the agility to the enterprise, but also the different consumption model, going from CapEx to OpEx. You don't have to spend a lot of money up front. So it gives you permission to experiment at a faster rate. So if you fail in some sort of endeavor you have undertaken as a big company or as a startup, you can pivot. You can just throw away that infrastructure and start something new. You don't pay a huge penalty. So how do you see that like helping our sort of companies? It can be auto company, it doesn't have to be high tech, wide sort of variety of industry, that the new way of consuming infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a key point is the new way of consuming infrastructure allows for fast failure at much lower cost and lower risk. So the whole, there are several vectors there. Infrastructure is code. So programmable infrastructure has sort of changed the way people experiment and actually scale. Though the notion of the API economy, being able to connect through APIs and build automation that can eliminate human labor, and I think there's an interesting discussion for this audience around the attractiveness of doing that, or lack thereof, frankly, if labor is cheap. But to your point, the pay by the drink pricing really does enable that experimentation and lets you test things out. It used to be very, very expensive to do that because you have to go buy a server and put some storage on it, maybe buy some Oracle licenses, and if you had any money left over, you could run your experiments. And I also think that we're seeing some fundamental changes in chip architecture, which are maybe outside of that discussion, and we don't want to go deep in there. But the only reason I think that's important is because we've, CIOs in the audience understand the importance of Moore's Law. We've marched to the cadence of Moore's Law for years, and the dynamics of that are changing in ways that are very positive for organizations because they can do new things with data-rich applications that they really couldn't do before because it was too expensive, or they didn't have the abundance of that processing power.
Yeah, I think we're focused on more on the Indian market or the South Asian market. That this is the event happening for that market. Keeping that in mind, I think for Indian market, the sort of lure of cloud is huge. But having said that, there are no sort of local players. I mean, I shouldn't say no. They are like very tiny local players in cloud sort of scene, even in Europe, right? Regionally, the U.S. sort of dominates, U.S. and China, if you will, right, as cloud providers. And having said that, I wanted to cover, I want to get your take on this topic of the cost of the cloud, right, and the cost of our automation versus having abundant supply of engineers back home in India. So how do you see that playing? I personally think that cloud providers need to do a sort of much cheaper pricing for markets like India, so that the economics is palatable, so that it's digestible for startups and for sort of mid-tier companies, or you can call SMB, you can call it. How do you see that?
I mean, I think normally, when you look at most economic models, you're 75, 80, sometimes even 85%. But I would say at least 2/3 of the cost of the life of a project, if you will, is labor. Now, that's not the case necessarily in India, but it's outside in certainly in the United States. That's the case. The one exception, by the way, is Oracle. Oracle license costs tend to be well over half of the cost. So that's a sort of another conversation. But I think I think cost you have to look at a number of ways. There's as you pointed out before, the shift from capex to opex, and if you're got a lot of cash on your balance sheet, maybe capex is not so onerous, and you don't really need that opex shift. Cost is, as I mentioned, labor, but not always the case in lower cost labor markets. U.S. average cost of an IT professional fully loaded is $120,000 U.S., much, much lower in other parts of the world. I think the cost is also opportunity cost. What do you want your people doing? And that comes back to skill sets. And can you apply somebody who is traditionally experienced at managing LUNs, or connecting ports? Can you apply that skill to other areas? And we're seeing efforts to retrain, for instance, Cisco CCIEs, or you see storage admins being retrained to learn Python coding and to develop new applications. But I do agree, or at least I infer from your comments, that the cheap labor makes cloud and automation less attractive economically.
Yeah, it does. At the same time, you are competing globally on many fronts. I think is a dichotomy of the whole thing is that you can throw bodies at the problem or you can throw automation at the problem, but automation always wins. That's what my sort of read is working in this industry for the last 25 years, that automation always wins, um, regardless of which market you represent. Even though the some markets have sort of cheaper manpower or skills, if you will.
Well, the other thing too about automation is at least in concept, and I think in reality, from the studies that we've done, it brings better quality, higher availability, more facile and accurate recovery, especially when you're into business critical or mission critical applications. Recovery, with your Oracle background, recovery is everything, right? For certain applications, and so automation can bring quality if you get it right. Sometimes automation does things that you don't want it to do, but if you get it right, it's a big win.
Yeah, I think automation plays a huge role by bringing the consistency and it gives you the scale sort of advantage. With automation, you can scale much faster, right? And with the scale, you can get economies of scale, and then you can build on top of that. And I think we are not touching upon that today, but I think that part of the infrastructure is how do you finance what you're doing? That part is very important as well. Like who's um, funding it? How is the VC scene in different countries? Um, how even the bankruptcy laws affect the innovation level of innovation. I was listening to Spain's Prime Minister. He was in Bay Area a couple of months back. He was stating that they have changed their bankruptcy laws in Spain to attract the expats from outside Spain to come there and build companies there. Having said that, India is changing gradually, and now today I think India has between 80 to 100 unicorns, which is huge. It was the sort of unheard of. That number was unheard of even a couple of years back. Um, how do you see the sort of the overall scene, if you will, keeping in mind how an economy innovates? And let me put it this way. In other words, what do you think is the secret sauce of U.S. has innovated, out innovated the world in many ways? What was the secret sauce here? I mean, I have my own couple of viewpoints, but I want to hear from you. What is the secret sauce here, which other other countries are trying to mimic?
I think part of it is just fundamentals. The U.S. is a large market, so you've got an inherent base to start with. Many, if not most, of the U.S. companies that have done really well start in the U.S. and then go overseas. It's very rare to see a company like UiPath that started. I mean, they did start overseas, but they were a global company from early days. And so normally, you see, take a company like Snowflake. It gestated for a number of years in the U.S. markets. I think that's part of it. I think culturally, it's very competitive markets. So you have big local markets and a very competitive local markets with sophisticated customers that push companies, and so those create a dynamic of innovation. And then you throw cloud into the mix. I mean, to your point earlier about scale, you've seen things in the last decade that were virtually impossible. And then you talk about pay for it. It's ironic that the Nick Carr article of Does IT Matter came out at a point when IT was just becoming the most important aspect, or one of the most important aspects with the data explosion. So the pay for, I think a lot of times comes from IT shifting from a cost center to a revenue enabler, and even a profit center. Not profit. We can talk about what profit really is. A lot of companies say they don't care about profits, but I know, for instance, Sarbjeet, in our own business, when we have a busy event season and we're hosting virtual events, our Amazon bill goes to the roof, and our controller starts asking tough questions. But the answer is there's revenue associated with that pays for those costs, and it allows us to enter new markets. And so I think that dynamic has really led to a lot of innovation. And by the way, it's not exclusive to Silicon Valley anymore. I mean, you're seeing companies globally really start to innovate. You mentioned the unicorns in India. You're seeing companies in Europe. A company like HelloFresh, right, changing the nature of how delicious dinners are delivered. Almost $2 billion company, growing like crazy. It's almost a $20 billion market cap. A company out of Germany. So you're seeing, Spotify, all kinds of cloud-based companies emerging, not just out of Silicon Valley. The whole crypto movement, that was not born in Silicon Valley. So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot happening outside Silicon Valley that people have, I think, successfully sort of copied some of the mantras we had, the blitzscaling and other sort of concepts we usually talk about here in Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of talent which has come from India here, and we have our top leaders in top tech leaders in the US. Many of them are from Indian educated, youth came here, and then they just did a great job.
Yeah, I have a lot of business friends that I often joke. Think about what Silicon Valley would look like without IIT graduates. Pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. Actually, IIT is, I've heard, I haven't studied there, but it's hard to get into IIT than Stanford or MIT. Many times more, it's harder to get in there because of the, I would say, pool of people who are trying to get to it.
Right.
So with that, I think any last sort of words of wisdom for CIOs or CXOs on how should they approach the sort of the infrastructure side of things in the risk taking, or from the technology side of things or process side of things? Like, how should they traverse this sort of ever-changing world to take advantage of the latest and greatest sort of infrastructure?
I do think that the cloud is a really important factor. And I think if you look at the big three US-based cloud companies, AWS has regions. I think they just added one in Hyderabad in last November. I think Azure's got at least 2 or 3 regions. GCP, I think, has at least 1. And so I think that changes the traditional way in which CIOs need to think about technology, because, as you all know, people and process and culture are the hard parts. Technology will come and technology will go. And the processes that are associated with expanding your network, if you're a Cisco engineer, or and we talked about Oracle DBAs, they got to understand the nuances of recovery. A SecOps pro, you got to understand the skills and tools required to keep people out, and then also how to approach incident response. I think cloud changes a lot of that. It doesn't solve it, but it changes it. For instance, in security, it's a shared responsibility model. There's certain things that the cloud vendor is going to take care of. So again, I think technology comes and it goes, but I think alignment is still more important than ever. Aligning with the lines of business for that sort of shifting the mindset to profit from a cost center. I think gone are the days of the us versus them in IT. For the most part, CIOs, I think, are an enabler to business results, and I think that's global. CIO is one of the few roles that has a pan-organizational responsibility. If you think about it, the CIO is naturally aligned with the CEO. They care about the growth of the company, profitability, making sure all the parts are working properly. And increasingly, I see one of the friction points, which was the CIO and the CFO, as changing. I think tech-savvy CFOs, they understand that tech is a differentiator, but it's fleeting. You have to keep moving forward and moving fast to maintain that competitive edge. And I guess the last thing I'd say is sort of tongue-in-cheek. The CIO used to be the joke, career is over, but I think today CIO is one of the most respected and important leaders in an organization because it touches technology, business, strategy, data, cyber. The CIO's partnering with the CISO. And so the CIO's got to understand the North Star of the company and then bring ideas to the table that accelerate that path. While at the same time, to your point, Sarbjeet, you got to understand the risk appetite of the organization and then put in processes and make decisions that manage those risks accordingly.
With that, thanks, Dave, for your words of wisdom, and thanks, guys, for listening in. And follow Dave Vellante through Cube, which is called the ESPN of Tech, and rightly so. Dave and John Furrier have interviewed world's sort of best technology leaders, and with that, they kind of soak in all these patterns from the market, and they give us that back as a service. You can look at the YouTube. They have a YouTube channel, and they have their own sort of a specific property, which is the Cube. And with that, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Sarbjeet. Thanks, everybody.